Alright, greetings everyone. This is going to be my first ever video. It will also be a tutorial on how to play Imperator Rome. This game can be pretty complicated at times, but in my opinion it doesn't take too much to master, so let's dig in. We'll start on single player with a new game. So obviously, first thing you see when you open this game is going to be a shit ton of playable nations. Obviously, I would imagine most of you on your first playthrough are probably going to go for Rome, so that's who we'll start out as. Now Rome is a weird government type, they're a republic. If you ever want to not have to deal with more of the political side, go with one of the Greek states. Those will probably be a little easier for anyone who's new and doesn't want to deal with like all the political intrigue right off the bat, but just to be safe, and if you really want to have your heart set on playing Rome, we'll start as Rome here. So I'm going to click Iron Man mode, just because I don't like to do the random saving. I feel like it's a little cheap, but I'm going to give it a start here, just play on normal difficulty. That way there's no modifiers to have to worry about yet. Alright, so Rome, you get your little prompt right off the bat. It gives you some background in ancient Rome and what's actually happened to the country in the time being. If you ever wanted to play like historically accurate, this would be a good way to start, just going through all this. But for us, we're going to start out with my tried and trues. Now, this game can get a little overwhelming at times. Each of these brings up a different menu. You have to balance your economy, your manpower. Political influence is helpful if you want to do anything with your government. Military experience lets you get different ideas. Stability gives you modifiers on all of your different abilities. Aggressive expansion is affected by invading your neighbors or certain acts that you can do. Tyranny is brought on by certain acts, primarily one of the big ones you'll run into early game as Rome is ramming through your war declarations through the Senate will guarantee you +5 tyranny. If you can keep it under 20, that's a pretty good level, although there are times that you want it over 20 if you want to do something like form the Roman Empire. War exhaustion is a pretty minimal thing to watch out for. You don't want it to get high, obviously. It's pretty easy to manage. It'll also give you a prompt if you're starting to accrue too much war exhaustion, but for the most part it won't really be too much of a factor for most people in this game. Alright, we'll start out with these little prompts up here. So the first one is we have our trade routes. Now this can be adversely affected, and if I went in and changed my economic policies right now I wouldn't have any trade routes to play with to begin with, but I'm going to leave them as is for now so I can show you what you gotta do. So this overall screen here can be a little overwhelming. You have your population here, the different makeup of your city. So you have your citizens, your freemen, your tribesmen, and your slaves. Now slaves are primarily responsible for most of your tax output, while citizens and freemen will produce more so your commerce and research. Freemen mostly are for your manpower, as you can see when I mouse over the screen here. Your manpower is represented up here, so right now Rome gains 158 each month, and there is no manpower loss to attrition. If I were fighting, this would be the little replenish armies portion would probably read a certain amount of troops that I need to replenish my armies. But seeing as we're not at war and I haven't taken any losses yet, that is still good to go. Obviously, as you can see below, it's affected by different modifiers that are pretty easy to check. Now I'll go through all this real quick. So in the top left screen, because this is my capital province, is the leader or consul of Rome. Now, since the 1.4, actually I think the 1.2 update, there have been 2 leaders for an aristocratic republic. So you'll have a consul and a co-consul. Now if you don't like the 2-leader system, it eventually does give you different options to change your government type later on. That's not a big deal, we won't worry about that quite yet. So we'll go back to this screen here. So right off the bat, you also have your governor policies. So each of these is helpful. A pretty solid one for your capital province, since it's always loyal, is acquisition of wealth. It will definitely max out how much money you're bringing in. That'll be one of the main struggles throughout the game, is keeping your economy balanced and making sure you have everything correct. As long as you watch out for your corruption on your rulers, though, you should be pretty well off. But you have other ones here as well, like religious conversion, cultural assimilation, bleed them dry, which you could do, but it'll actually decrease your output with the unrest that'll go on, so I try to avoid that one if I can. Not to mention your capital is where the majority of your captured slaves from conquest will go, so if you get that minus 25% food modifier, that's really going to hurt you later on. There's borderlands that you can do if you have a province, say, under attack relentlessly against a larger opponent that you don't quite have the troops to take out yet. Encourage trade, which is really one of my favorites. I go to it a lot, especially with the fact that some of my provinces get pretty swollen with slaves later on. Social mobility, which allows you to promote your populations, like moving slaves over to freemen or citizens. It is important to note that your cities and your provinces will have different buildings, and they'll also have a different preference for population. Tribesmen generally are not a thing for your more civilized nations. You will have tribesmen from time to time, but for the most part, the desired ratio of them will sit at 0%. Not a big deal there, nothing to worry about. That's something you'll worry about more so if you're like a Gallic tribe or a Hispanic tribe. So then, yeah, you'll see here there's one citizen and a freeman, so this is mostly a province that's dedicated to producing grain. The next thing you'll see on here is you have this double bar, so as you can see, this is your provincial loyalty. Now your capital, like I said, is always loyal, so that's why I like to go with this governor policy. This bar represents how much loyalty it is. It just winds up on a scale of 0 to 100 for most nations. Then you have your overall province. So if you look here, it's highlighted. So your overall province output. So up here we have plus 2.74 from my tax revenue and plus 2.71 from my commerce revenue. Now, as I said before, this is generated by your slaves, this is generated by your citizens. Your freemen here don't produce much of anything, they are mainly for manpower. And as you can see, I have positive food in Rome, so that's good news, and my province food stockpile is at 0 per month. That'll obviously update once we hit play later. You can check your religion, which is Hellenic for the Romans, and your national culture, and that is Roman. Now, if you're ever curious what each different region starts out as, or if you're slowly converting areas and you want to see your progress, you can always swap your cultural map mode up and check on all the different culture types. So as you can see, most of this is Roman throughout Italy, except for some areas that have been colonized by the Greeks, primarily in Syracuse and Magna Graecia. As you can see, all of Greece is obviously Hellenic. And then you have some other smaller ones like Dalmatians, Gallics, and here is your Iberian. And you have your Celt Iberians, your Punic, and Numidians. So those are the big ones that you'll deal with as Rome, but you'll eventually get over towards the Persian groups, which you'll definitely have quite a bit of. Egypt is one of the weird ones because they start out with their country is technically Hellenic, but most of their population is Nilotic. So, as you can see, that's pretty helpful later on when you have to deal with like happiness of different culture groups. But as you start out, other than some Hebrews in your capital, you are basically 100% Roman. And as you can see, that's not always static. You can assimilate populations and convert them over to your state religion and your state culture. Eventually they will all convert. There are buildings that modify those speeds as well, so you can convert faster. And it is worthwhile to say that it's easier to maintain your population if they're uniform, because then you can just spec heavily for bonuses for your primary culture group as opposed to wrong culture groups. Over here we have our civilization value. That shows us the supply limit for said city, the happiness of your citizens and freemen. As you can see, the local tribesman happiness is lower, and that's because those are generally avoid more centralized nations. Rome is considered one of the centralized nations. If you ever wanted to play as a non-centralized, any of the Gallic tribes will do, although there's a few really strong ones that I would strongly recommend. Over here, you can see your balance, as we went over earlier. This is your balance of citizen to freeman to slave in your city. There are buildings that you can build to affect that. I would highly recommend your capital being mostly citizen-based because you are going to accrue a lot of slaves in your capital, and this will allow them to be promoted, and also it's easier to keep them happy. As I said here, this is your food modifier, and you can also recruit your cohorts from this screen. I wouldn't really recommend it. So this is all of your units throughout the game. So you have archers, heavy cavalry, heavy infantry, light cavalry, light infantry, supply trains, camel cavalry, chariots, horse archers, and war elephants. Each of these are affected by a different trade good. So say you wanted to have camel archers, you would need to be importing camel. If you want to have elephants, obviously you'll need elephants. If you want horse archers, you'll need steppe horses, which are different from regular horses. Regular horses allow you to build heavy cavalry and light cavalry units. Luckily, as Rome, you actually start out in a pretty solid spot. Your capital has both a surplus of horses and of iron, which lets you have a really strong early military composition. And then you can see other things here, like say your food supply is getting low and you have some trade routes to spare. This is generally what I spend all my trade routes on, is importing grain. It's the highest food volume that you'll be able to get, so +5 food for every grain that you import. And you want to try and keep this full because, like I said, you're going to swell the population of your capital pretty quick. And the rest of these all have their own little bonuses. A surplus of wine, as you can see, there's different surplus levels. So the top one is if you're just importing this to your province. Say you imported wine into a regular province. The free men in that territory are going to get +1% wine in that local region. In the total province, which is the whole area, you will be able to get 1% freeman happiness, and if you have a surplus in your capital, it decreases your army maintenance, and if you export wine as well, it will also decrease your army maintenance costs. So, play around with this, get an idea of what looks good, what doesn't. My ideal build for a starting army is between 3 to 5 heavy infantry, 3 to 5 light cavalry, and 3 to 5 of the heavy cavalry in each thing. I'm going to go on ahead and start out and build 3 heavy cavalry right off the bat. That's going to let me have a pretty strong military composition, and because I will have cavalry in here, I'm going to change over my army positions. So I generally either have my heavy infantry or my heavy cavalry hit first, mainly because the AI really tends to favor archers as their start, as you could see earlier, but as is the default. So I always throw on the heavy cavalry, because if you look here, they do +50% damage versus archers. And they really only have minuses versus war elephants, and a very slight minus against heavy infantry. But for the most part, heavy cavalry are going to do a lot of good work for you. Heavy infantry are also very solid to have. Not a lot of people have the horse archers right off the bat. They are weak against light cavalry, but that's just due to the fact that the light cavalry are much more maneuverable. But they're also a very solid one to start with if you don't have horses and are playing someone like, say, Sparta, who starts out with iron in their capital but with no horses. So we'll go over these tabs next. So this first one here is your nation overview. So as you can see right now, this gives me a view of all of the different provinces that I have territories in. Now noted, I don't own all of the territories in each of these provinces. Like Eternum, most of these are my client states and even one neutral nation. So I only have these 2 provinces right here that are actually there. But it will show every province that you have any sort of territory located in. You can also change all of your government policies from here, so most of these are set to an assimilation speed, which in my opinion for Italy is not necessary, because you're going to have a lot of Roman people that you're going to wind up incorporating. These This tradition will become more important as you get outside of Italy and expand into, say, like Sicily and North Africa, and especially in Greece. But basically anywhere that isn't naturally Roman right off the bat. Another thing to pay attention to here is we have our different ideas. Now, each different government type has different types of ideas. If you match up the types of ideas with their icon above, you will gain a bonus. So as you can see here, as an aristocratic republic, I get 2 martial ideas, or military ideas, and 1 oratory idea. These are also influenced by your research later on, but right off the bat you start at level 0, so we're going to go on ahead and take the most basic ones that probably anyone playing an aristocratic republic will wind up taking, and that is plus 10% to the morale of your armies. And between these two, personally, the shipbuilding costs, ships aren't that expensive to build in the first place, and they're mostly expensive in the maintenance early game. So I don't bother with the shipbuilding one. I opt for the reinforcement speed and army morale recovery. That way you can just keep on hitting the enemy while you're expanding through Italy. So I'll go with that one. Now for your oratory ideas, there's 2 that I generally try to stick to. One that's really good right off the bat is your monthly, or sanctioned privileges, which decreases your monthly corruption. We'll cover this later, but corruption is something that eventually is going to sneak up from behind and cause your character wages to spike out of control in cost if you don't stay on top of it most of the game. Rome does start out with some advantages against corruption right off the bat, but throwing this on there will help ensure that you're going to have pretty cheap character costs most of the time, because eventually those are going to start to eclipse your army costs, and eventually be hundreds of times, or dozens of times more, potentially, if you're not paying attention to your ruler corruption. So there's also other ones. There's religious ideas and civic ideas. You can change your government type later to get bonuses for selecting different ones of these. My favorite is Oligarchic Republic, in which case you can take complex tariffs, so that adds plus 20%. And if you start out as someone who has a civic idea, this is fantastic because you can boost your national product right off the bat and just start speccing super heavily for citizens right away, as opposed to having to worry about having enough slaves to maintain your tax base until you're strong enough to increase your commerce. But because I'm an aristocratic republic, I'm going to take sanctioned privileges to keep my corruption down. Now you'll see here there's a check mark. That means I got my bonuses active. This will also be effective by your aggressive expansion later on. This is just a way to check on what your aggressive expansion actually is. And because I am an aristocratic republic, it tells me my country's civilization level, which is a plus 35% value to all of my civilization. This is my current country's civilization level. It is at 49%. Which is pretty solid, and you can increase this with different researches. The next screen is your government type. So in here, it looks a little overwhelming at first. So you have your total government, your offices, and your laws. So right off the bat, you'll see that you have, as an aristocratic republic, a consul and a co-consul. They are both elected every 5 years. So my next election will be on the 1st of October in 455. If you find that you have a leader that you really like, there is an option that you can take to try and keep them appointed essentially for life as any sort of republic, but we'll go over that later. The main thing being, if you want to be able to become an empire, that is the route you'll need to take. So if you look down here, we have all of our different factions, and we have like our leaders faction. So because our leader comes from the civic faction, I get plus 20% national tax, and empowering the civic faction is 50% less expensive. So eventually you'll really come to value these. My favorite one to hit is the military faction, because generally they're supportive of any wars that you want to start. Say you need 40 seats in favor of starting a war. So if I were to click on my neighbors below me, the Samnites, see here I have only 38 seats that are behind declaring war on Samnium. That means that I need to rally support in the Senate through my government tab to be able to go to war. The easiest way to do that is to give one pump on the military faction, and more than likely, I need a couple more, so I need one more pump. Oh, I just can't start a war before November 1st, 450. So now I will be able to go to war with Samnium. Now, one thing to note, if I were to click on this screen right now, it would opt that I do not have any sort of Casus Belli on them. So what I would have to do in order to form a Casus Belli is come down here and click on Fabricate Claims, which I'm actually going to do. They are always my first conquest playing as Rome. And now what that's going to do is you look in the right corner on your outliner. I have active diplomacy. I am justifying and creating a claim on Samnium, and it's progressing by plus 6.20% each month. So that's going to tally up until it hits 100%, in which case my claim will be done, and I can declare war on them without taking the stability hit that would come from declaring war for a superiority war. Now, defensive wars, you don't have to worry about claims, and you also don't need to worry about claims for taking territory. Once it does make taking said territory cheaper in terms of your aggressive expansion and the actual war score cost. But say someone declares war on you and you have no claims on them, you'll be pretty well off. Now, the next thing we'll go over is our military, or actually, let's finish the government tab. So, we've talked about how to boost your support. Basically, the most important thing, unless you're trying to form your empire, and I wouldn't recommend doing this until mid or late game, is avoiding populist faction influence. They kill your political influence, which makes it difficult to do just about anything. You need political influence to do everything from justifying war on other people, to bribing your own officials to keep them loyal. I would definitely recommend avoiding populists at all costs until you're ready for it. So in here we have our offices, and as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of each of the portraits, you have a different faction that each one supports. The most important faction to pay attention to is the one that winds up representing your censor. This is going to increase the influence of each of these. They have a natural influence that they're going to increase or decrease by. So right now I have 1.20 support for military faction, which means that more than likely my military candidate here, who's running to be the next consul of Rome, is most likely going to win. He has excellent stats of 10 martial, and I always forget the names of these. 8 finesse, 7 charisma, and 6 zeal, so in my opinion he will be a fantastic ruler. I'm excited for him to come to power. My current leader is also pretty solid, so I'm not too hurt about that either. Rome does start out with quite a bit of steam to keep on moving through everything else. And if you look down here, you'll also have different bonuses. So your Praetor, he helps you with your aggressive expansion. So eventually, once you go on further into the game, your aggressive expansion, say I was to take the entire boot of Italy right now, I'd probably get 30 aggressive expansion. As long as you keep the number below 50, you're going to get negative effects, but they're not going to absolutely cripple you. The further you go over 50, the harder it's going to be to keep loyal provinces, to keep loyal characters, and to basically keep your population happy and keep your treasury balanced. One thing I might change out here is my Prefectus Militaris. As you can see, the guy in the slot there only has 6 martial. I'm going to replace him with Publius Sulpicus Severio with 9 martial. And as you can see, that increases my national tax, which in turn will give me more money each month. So as you can see, last month was 1.99, this month will be 2.24, which means that increased it by a whopping 0.25. Which doesn't seem like a lot, but as you get into this game, you'll learn more and more what does and doesn't help you. Now, that actually popped up a different icon over here. And one thing you'll notice is they have different colored backgrounds. Anything that's red, you want to try to handle immediately. That means something bad is happening, such as a scorned family, civil war could potentially break out, a rebellion, all sorts of things. This, luckily, is the easiest of all of the things to take care of, because it will not cost you anything. They're just unhappy that they're out of a job. So what I will do here is I will just grab the guy who I just took out of that government slot, throw him as the head of my navy, and now they're all satiated again. So as you can see here, you can play around with this. If you mouse over it, you'll see all the different modifiers you get. As we go on, you'll figure out more things. Now here are your laws. You can tell if the Senate supports or opposes you changing said laws by the little icon in the top left corner. So see, I would be approved for military reforms, assembly endorsement, religious laws, citizenship laws, land reforms, integration laws, maritime laws. The only thing they're not a big fan of is election reform, and these are actually really hard to do. You obviously need quite a bit of support from the Senate for this. The easiest one of these to actually do is Princeps Civitas, which actually looks like the hardest one, but if you appoint a dictator and he refuses to step down after, say, the conclusion of a war, he will immediately adopt that government type for you. Now, it does give you populist influence, and if you remember earlier, you'll hear me saying that that was bad. Now, populist influence is bad up until mid-game if you want to become an empire, which actually makes the game a little easier for you, because then you just appoint things by your bloodlines and have a lot more power, and you don't have to deal with that pesky Senate. Alright, the next few things are a little bit easier of Windows. The military one, so right in here you can tell your traditions. So these will eventually be modified by your military experience. As you can see, I'm getting plus 0.30 each month. Once that reaches 100, I will be able to select a tradition. This does go up based on the experience of your armies, so if you're in peacetime and you have a bunch of extra gold laying around, feel free to exercise your armies to gain more experience for that. Now, as you can see, they're pretty solid bonuses. I'm not going to go over all those, because if you're playing the game, you can already see it yourself. This shows you your overall added discipline, the morale of your armies, your siege ability, your fort defense, enslavement efficiency, everything like that. And then all of the different attributes for your ships. I'm not going to go over those too much, because we'll see those as we play. So the next thing is your technology. So over here you'll see on the left we have people in each slot. So each of these guys are researching for us. If you look here, you'll see the modifier that's applied to the research speed. This is where you want to put your highest level characters. This is important because as you go on, you get better and better ideas that basically cut the cost of all of your expenses and boost your income so that you can get this your economy up there so you can support more armies, which is the end goal of Imperator, which in my opinion is to conquer the entire map if you can. So as you can see in here, we have some of the modifiers: increased siege abilities, national tribesman output. I try to avoid the tribesman ones as Rome, since like I said, you're not going to have a lot of tribesmen. Loyalty of characters, which as you'll see later on, gets pretty important. So that's the entirety of the technology tree. The religion tree seems a little confusing at first. The most important thing to be paying attention to is your sacrifice to the gods. That will help increase your stability, as you can see when I mouse over this, because my stability is below 50%. I am actually getting negative modifiers. It dropped below 50%, even though we started there, because I use that endorsed party cost. That's why you don't want to do that too much. You'll boost your tyranny, and your stability will go to shit, and you have to have it above 30% in order to declare war anyway. So you don't want to try to max it out to gain more support and then have your stability be below 20%, because those seats that you gain will go away with time. So the next thing to look at here is all of our omens. This little icon denotes that you have an omen ready. They are generally good for 5 years. You can get modifiers to extend or shorten said omens, but in general, these will be used to modify your nation. My favorite one is the Jupiter one. Now, this holy site is located in Rome. You do have different modifiers for it, like monthly civilization change and population capacity, which in my opinion are fairly important for Rome. This helps to decrease aggressive expansion. However, my aggressive expansion is currently at 0 and it's not needed, so I always, right off the bat, go with Mercury, because that actually increases your national commerce income. Now, one important thing is these are all Hellenic deities, but you are fully capable of taking other nations nearby and worshipping their gods for your omens. It's not specific to your own religion. Now, it is easier to build your own shrines if you have your own religion, but you can sack other religion shrines and bring home their goodies as well. They have little relics that you can obtain. As you can see, I have 5 extra things in my reliquary, and each one has different bonuses. You can plug these in here and gain extra bonuses on top of your regular. Now, it is important to note that the top one is actually a passive effect, so you automatically get this just for having the omen selected in your pantheon. But in order to activate the bottom one, you need to actually click on it. So I'm going to click on this portrait here, and it's going to bring up Mercury. Calling on Mercury will grant national commerce income of plus 13.46%, and it will last 5 years until October 1st, 455. I'm going to click OK. That is going to boost my commerce output yet again, as you can see, by 0.15 more. Might not seem like a lot, but that's enough to support at least another 1,000 men. So that's your religion screen. The next thing is your economy. So this is your economy screen. It seems a little daunting, but in here you have all of your expenses and you can balance your budget in here. So you have your tax income. You can have it on low taxes, which lowers your national unrest, but you lose 50% of your national tax income. You can have it on default, and there are no effects, no bad, and no good. I generally stick to the harsh taxation since I put in so many citizens into my nation. It really doesn't hurt me that much. I'm still able to outpace the AI in terms of research, and I get way more money. So I'm going to go ahead right off the bat and just click on harsh taxation. As you can see, that just jumped up. Now, commerce is a tricky one. So I generally stick to the free trade option. However, right off the bat, you're actually going to want to leave it on trading permits because this increases the number of import routes in your capital, which in the beginning of the game actually nets you more money. I get roughly 0.3 per month from each of my import routes. That adds 2 there. And if I were to switch down to this would drop to somewhere between like 1.2 and 1.5, which would be a huge cut and actually take out. Now, I just tend to avoid the transaction taxation, which is your import value of plus 20%. However, if you are playing as a small nation and you are like importing most of your food and everything like that, you do get money just for importing stuff, so I would actually slap that on if you're playing as a small nation, say as like a city-state over in Greece. The rest of these are pretty self-explanatory. You have your army maintenance. I generally try to leave it on default and try to keep my balances positive because it is actually quite nice to buy off mercenaries with the gold that you have stored. You can, if you're in a pinch, decrease your army maintenance. That will actually be your largest one if you can keep your corruption under control. If you can't keep your corruption under control, your wages are going to wind up being the highest. But as you can see right now, it goes my military, then wages, then fort maintenance, and fleet maintenance. You can also decrease these, but like I said, they have a pretty big effect on morale. And that means you will basically lose any battle you come into contact with if you do not have these at least on default. And you can increase them and increase your morale by an additional 10%, but in my opinion, leaving them where they're at and taking your normal modifiers, maybe activating an omen for discipline or morale bonuses, are the better way to go. So this little clay pot up here just denotes a open trade route in my capital. Now mind you, if all of these are X's and you're trying to import something and you desperately need it, just double check that you have enough money to actually do that. Without the mercantile stance activated, it is 15 gold to activate a trade route. So I am going to right off the bat start importing grain to Rome and get my food supplies as stocked up as they can be. Right now my capacity is at 1100. So that's done. The next thing it's prompting me to do is I have a lack of a commander. And if you look on the right here, you can see their martial ability. Directly above that is how old they are. Mind you, characters in this game follow a health scheme, so they could potentially die fairly soon if they're as old as 60, but I'm still going to put him in charge anyway because he is my best tactician. If you click on here, you can see the character screen. This goes over all of their stats as we saw earlier. This also is denotes their prominence, which in turn weights the number of citizens that supports their family. Now he is a minor character, so he does not have a family to have to worry about, so I won't get that little scorn tab in the top right here if I were to move him out. Now he also has the wounded trait, which decreases his martial by 1. Now if he did not have that, this would be 11, and that would be fantastic. But he does have tactician, which offsets it and makes him slightly stronger. Over here you have all of your different options. You have banish, but first you have to imprison them, and I would just generally recommend trying to avoid imprisoning your characters. If you botch it, you can cause a civil war, and that might just make your game unplayable, or at the very least set you back 10 to 15 years. Now you have all of these other options here. I try to hold on to them because bribing costs your political influence and also increases that pesky corruption that we're trying to keep a hold of. Everything else here has to do with, well, the Triumph will boost the loyalty, but it also A, costs a lot of gold, and B, you need to be able to have them win a victory within the last 720 days, or 2 years. Which seems like a lot of time, but in this game, 2 years flies by. If their corruption does get too high, you can take a loyalty hit on the character and remove 20 corruption. As you can see, his corruption is currently at 0, which is great news for me, and I don't have to hit that. This is where you would bring them to trial to try to imprison them, and it will give you a chance of success. I would not recommend at any point in time, no matter how desperate you are, going for a bring to trial if they are at a low chance. Most likely all you will get is a civil war. So you can recruit generals from foreign nations if they're neutral, but you do, as you see there, it says +10, and you're wondering what that little symbol is. That is your aggressive expansion. So if he were a foreign general, I could recruit him with that. You can also pay to reward their veterans, because eventually the cohorts that are serving in this, the cohorts, one cohort is 1,000 men in this, they will become loyal, and if this character becomes disloyal, they will support him in terms of a civil war. You can make him rival of your consul, but the only reason to do this is if you really want to assassinate either one of them, because you can then play in assassinations. You can do seek treatment, so over here we have a health bar next to their portrait. As you can see, he is changing by negative 0.08% per month. This is due to his wounded trait that we saw over here. Eventually it will kill him. He is not able to seek treatment yet. I can seek a treatment for wounded, but I need 200 gold to do so. And you can smear reputation if a general gets too popular and they're really like causing a lot of loyalty from their units, and you know that you're going to have issues putting a new general at the head of that army. You can smear their reputation to make it a little easier. Now you have your regular diplomacy tab. I never use this window. I always just go on the screen and right click whatever nation I want to get to, just because scrolling through this tab is a nightmare in itself. As you can see, there are literally hundreds of different nations. It's not worth my time. But the only reason this screen is useful in the first place, and probably the only 2 times you will need to open it for yourself, will be to change your stance. Now if you look on here, I don't have enough political power to do this yet, but you have different bonuses. So neutral stance increases your diplomatic relations. Appeasing stance removes aggressive expansion and improves makes improved relations a lot cheaper. Your mercantile stance, which is one of my favorites, decreases the cost of trade routes, and it increases your national commerce output by 25%. The bellicose stance is very helpful in terms of fabricating claims, and the war score cost, which is actually very helpful if you want to claim more territory, and the domineering stance, which means that your subjects will gain a +20 opinion of you and be quicker to integrate. Now Rome does start out with 4 subjects, but in my opinion they're very helpful in the beginning, especially when you're at wars with these smaller nations around you. I wouldn't bother touching that. I would leave that alone until you have enough to maybe do the commerce one, but even then, the increased war score the decreased war score cost is actually really going to help you when you're trying to aggressively expand as Rome, because as you see, in terms of all the major players, they are actually the smallest one, with only 23 territories. Carthage starts out as a major power with 112, and these are scaled here. If you look at the bottom on that, you can actually see the number that you need for each one. So we are actually a local power, which is 2 steps below Carthage, but eventually we are going to come up and fight Carthage. Macedon over here is a regional power, which is the rank in between Carthage and myself. Generally the first and quickest one to a great power, the strongest one on that list, is Phrygia. Most of the time they'll do it. They do like to have their civil wars. The Seleucid Empire might look intimidating, but they fall apart pretty quickly. Maria is pretty stable if you ever wanted to play as them, but it also is like walking over people because you start out with so many bonuses. Although they also have problems with civil wars. Alright, that covers the basic introduction. I'm going to stop this video here before it gets too long. It's already 40 minutes and I'm going to have to cut it. So I will talk to you guys later.